Good morning. It is 9 o'clock here in the Philippines. Welcome to the book launch of Drugs and Philippine Society, newly published by Ateneo Press. I'm Vincent and I'll be your moderator for today. Now, a brief background about the book. The book collects some 18 chapters that collectively tries to understand a much misunderstood topic, and a topic that is very much in tune with the political atmosphere of the times. There are chapters that attempt to dissect the history. There are chapters that attempt to interrogate the drug war. There are chapters that attempt to reimagine what drug policy can be in the Philippines. It is precisely the second part of this book, Interrogating the Drug War, that is the subject of our book launch today. Now, to tell us more about the book, let me call on none other than our book editor, our dear colleague and friend, Dr. Gideon Lasco.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and thank you very much to everyone for joining us in this occasion where we're launching this book. Drugs remain at the forefront of public discourse in the Philippines today, with the president accusing a presidential candidate of using cocaine and candidates distancing themselves from drugs, many of them expressing willingness to undergo a drug test. Meanwhile, the hypocritical drug war continues as the UP Diliman Third World Study Center has faithfully and courageously documented. There have been at least 512 reported drug related killings from January 1 to November 7 of this year. In an age of lower standards, I suppose that we have to welcome the mere fact that many of the candidates profess, at the very least, that they will not condone extrajudicial killings, that they will pursue a different approach to drugs. But is drug policy simply a choice between killing people or sending them to rehab centers? Can we ask what kind of rehab is actually needed? Are there no other alternatives to it? And can we not also interrogate the very paradigms that we use in dealing with drugs, including the implicit assumption in our society that all kinds of drug use are evil or at least problematic? These are the questions that we want to raise in public discourse today. The same questions that we try to answer in the book that we're launching today, Drugs and Philippine Society, which I had the honor of editing. The idea for the book started when Duterte embarked on his drug war, and it became very clear that there was very little local material to respond to the prevailing discourse of we should kill drug addicts. I myself had done research on shabu use among young people from 2011 to 2013, finding that they use shabu as pampagilas or as a performance enhancer for the many and often demanding jobs that they take. I decided to revisit my data and write more papers out of it, including how those young men engage in sex work and perceived law enforcement. That was also around the time when I met scholars who were likewise seeking to challenge the regime's discourses and policies through research. While many of us were publishing in academic journals, participating in various fora, we realized that a full fledged book would make our research findings accessible to the public while allowing us to also feature past scholarship. Thankfully, Ateneo Press, including its director Karina Velasco, was supportive from the time that we met in the Philippine Studies Conference in Hiroshima exactly 3 years ago. And so were organizations like Ateneo's Development Studies Program, APCASO, and Release, civil society groups that have supported us. Similar projects by scholars like Nicole Corato and Jail Cornelio on the Duterte presidency and on Filipino millennials, respectively, were likewise an inspiration for this book. But I have to say that it's really a collective effort by so many people. From Vincent Yu, who's our moderator today, a doctor who's also taking up medical anthropology and who also served as editorial assistant for this book. The people in Ateneo Press, Julian de la Serna, Carl Castro, who made the cover, Rafi Lerma, the photojournalist, whose work I'm sure many of you are familiar with, who curated the images in the book alongside the photographers who provided all of these images to us. And even longtime drug policy advocate Ines Feria, who served as a sounding board to us in conceptualizing the book. And of course, the authors themselves. It was never easy to do research on drugs amid a drug war. And it was never easy to write about drugs amid a pandemic that has disrupted our professional and personal lives. So, for this book to come out today, amid an administration that has trafficked on people's fears and prejudices on drugs and on people who use drugs, is a testament to the dedication of so many people, and to them, I can only express my admiration and gratitude. I will not be able to provide you with a full summary of the book today, which is exactly the point of writing it. We need to acknowledge the complexity of drug issues if we are to appropriately respond to them. And in the coming months, we will be holding a series of events like this one that we're having today that will allow our authors to share their insights and engage with the public on these issues. Even so, as we inaugurate this conversation that I hope will continue in the months and the years to come, I would like to share some key messages that can contribute to elevating the drug policy discourse in the country. First, we need to let go of our biases about drugs and the people who use them. Drugs are, as authors Michael Tan, Emma Porio, Christine Crisol, and the late Richard Zarco show, are a social and political construction. If the potential for addiction and harm are the sole criteria for why we criminalize drugs, then alcohol will rank highly on the list. And even pharmacologically speaking, we are all drug users because of the caffeine we drink daily, the alcohol many of us consume occasionally, among others. If Jose Rizal were alive today, writes Ambeth Ocampo in his chapter in the book, he would probably be found dead on a Manila street with a crude cardboard sign identifying him as a drug user, given that the national hero tried hashish as a teen, and he wrote about it in one of his writings. In the book, we try to look at all of these substances without the prejudices that have been attached to each of them. So the first message is that we need to let go of our biases about drugs and the people who use them. Second, we need to interrogate the drug war by looking at its consequences on the communities affected the most and documenting the roles of various sectors in enabling and resisting it. Thus, the sociologist Filomin Gutierrez, Ma'am Ging, our first speaker today, presents counter narratives from persons detained for drug offenses, showing how paradoxically, while they are on the receiving end of punitive drug policies, they were interviewed in while being detained. They actually welcome the drug war, even as they distance themselves from the label of addict. Thus, the urban anthropologist May Racelis, our second speaker, reminds us in her chapter that EJKs with Nanlaban represent only one among the many crosses that urban poor drug forward day in and day out, while articulating how community organizing has opened up new avenues of awareness and involvement among people who initially felt powerless to bring about change. Thus, Ica Fernandez, a development practitioner and our third panelist today, alongside her co-authors Micaela Villalon, Abby Pangilinan, and Nastasia Quijano, show how communities in Metro Manila have responded to the drug war, noting that even the simple act of caring for each other has become subversive and even challenging, radical, in that it goes against the predominant political and social climate. But, as one of their informants tell them, they cannot succumb to fear because their very communities are under attack. Thus, Anna Warburg presents perspectives about the drug war from the police officers themselves, who, to borrow from Jail Cornelio and Aaron Medina, two of our other authors, see what they're doing, the implementation of Aplang Tokhang as a righteous intervention. So the police officers see what they're doing as actually righteous. And we also need to critically engage with these perspectives. And thus, Jail and Aaron themselves chart the responses from Christian groups, finding the dominant view that drug users are sinners hints as an implicit religious underpinning for the popular support for the war on drugs. And thus, Cheryl Soriano, Claire David, and Jenna Atun problematize how the media itself has helped crystallize the narratives that drug addicts are evil and need to be eliminated. So the second message, again, is that we need to interrogate the drug war by looking at its consequences on communities and in the nation and documenting the roles of various sectors in either enabling or resisting it. And the third and last key message, among many, is that we need to reimagine drug policy in ways that are humane and evidence based, in ways that account for the role, for instance, of local government, of LGUs, as explained by Dean Ron Mendoza and his co-authors Michael Henry Uzingo and JV Gamboa in their chapter, or of social movements like the one articulated by Nex Bengson in his chapter on the local cannabis movement and how they position themselves in relation to the drug discourse in the country, or even international actors, given that drug policy is both a national and a transnational issue, as pointed out in the book by regional drug policy advocates Gloria Lai, Claudia Soitescu, and Ricky Gunawan. And finally, even the arts and the humanities, as argued and articulated by poets Christine Ong Muslim and Vincent Yu. It is time to decriminalize drug use. The physician lawyer Lee Garcia argues in his chapter that calls for urgent criminal justice and public health reforms. We need to explore harm reduction ordinances. Human rights lawyer Kathy Alvarez remonstrates in hers. If we can get our presidential candidates to debate about these propositions, then it would be an achievement in itself. If we can get more academics, civil society groups, and individual citizens to engage with drug issues at this kind of discourse, then that too would be an achievement, especially if we can work with journalists, media practitioners, community organizers, educators in conveying and improving our message while willing to learn from people's attitudes, innovations, practices, and experiences. Lives are at stake in this issue. Families, communities, and our nation itself, especially as the addict, prefigures the pasaway in one of the many ways in which violence, both structural and real, operates in our country. The road ahead is long, but the thought of Kian de los Santos, Carl Arnaiz, and the many thousands who have been killed, orphaned, widowed, jailed, stigmatized, and vilified should keep us going. This work must continue. And as our book hopefully conveys, the starting point, or one of the starting points for elevating the drug discourses and hopefully reforming our drug policies, is recognizing that there is more to the drug war than Duterte, and there is more to drug issues than just the drug war. Thank you again, everyone, for supporting this book. I look forward to our panel today, and I wish you all a good morning. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Gideon. Truly, it takes a village to make a book, and it takes a village to alter, to reshape how an entire society views a long maligned subject. Now, to get along with our book launch, let me reintroduce our three panelists for this morning. Gideon has already gave a brief introduction about them. So, to begin, we have our first panelist, Professor Filomin Gutierrez, whom we all fondly call Mam Ging. She's a professor of sociology at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. where she teaches social deviance, the sociology of violence, and research methods. So her research has focused on crime, delinquency, the history of Philippine criminology, prison gangs, among others. Our second panelist is Professor May Racelis. She's an urban anthropologist. Her work has focused on informal settlers, community organizing, gender, children, reproductive health, all with a focus on communities as partner researchers. And lastly, we are joined by Ica Fernandez, who is a spatial planner and interdisciplinary researcher whose work in the last decade has spanned the implementation and evaluation of political processes and socioeconomic programs related to violence, vulnerability, social cohesion, and open governance in the Philippines. Now, our book launch this morning will take on a somewhat unconventional form. We won't be giving you academic lectures. Instead, we're gonna take this in a different direction. We're gonna have a tete-a-tete, quote unquote, with our panelists. So to begin, let me throw our first question. Um, can any of our panelists share some highlights of their chapter from the book? Um, Maybe we can have Prof. Ging start the conversation.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Congratulations, Gideon, Vincent, and for coming up with this volume. What can I say about the highlights of my study? My chapter tries to represent the counter narratives, stories that run counter, uh, give a skeptical view, and contest and challenge the discourse in the war on drugs. And this come from the very persons, who were arrested as drug personalities. So um, my interest in doing the study had to do with my ongoing interest in violence. No? And I've studied before fraternity violence, gang riots, and in crime itself. Um, this took on a different approach. I wanted to know what it was for so-called drug offenders to experience a war against them. No? And I found that they have suffered, talagang tremendous violence, and the idea of violence, in this context as legitimately um, uh, forwarded by the government, the state being the legitimate source of coercive force, is experienced in a catastrophic manner by the men. No? So they were non-combatants in a war. No? So they contest the allegation that they were addicts. And as a matter of fact, katulad ng mga work ni Gideon, they use drugs to enable themselves, to enable them to work. These are poor, precarious workers living in urban poor communities. They said, nung una, syempre ayaw nilang aminin, no? But nung sinabi na nilang, minsan gumagamit ako ng drugs, pero hindi ako addict. I use it to overcome the difficulties in my work, to always make myself prepare should work be available, and napagkamalan akong addict. So I wanted to understand that perspective. And my takeaway in trying to unpack what is the essence, or what does violence mean in specific contexts as they are experienced by victims and perpetrators, because later on I did do my interviews also of police officers. And it's interesting how violence can start with an instrumental rationale, no? Nasasabihin ng police, gagawin namin ito dahil ito yung paraan para mahuli yung mga offenders. And even the so-called drug personalities understand that, no? They do this so they can catch um, uh, the addicts, no? But that instrumentality can easily turn and spiral out of control and then become cruel, no? Become gratuitous violence. So I was interested in unpacking that concept of violence, and in the words of my um, respondents, nor of my participants, they said, and it's encapsulated by what they say, wala kaming kalaban-laban. No? And unpacking that, walang kalaban-laban means doon sa physical force by which the police came in and um, arrested them. And then wala rin silang kalaban-laban sa criminal justice system. No? Yung pagkakulong nila, meron silang sinasabi na parang hayop ang trato sa amin. No? So these are all narratives that I think we need to see, that the war on drugs has really brought suffering. No? And the target population is lower class men, urban poor, precarious workers. No? And siguro later, to give space for our other speakers, I just like to mention one more point. What puzzled me also was the support for the war on drugs by the very participants that I interviewed. Even went to the point of asking, kayo na nga itong nakulong. Why do you support the war on drugs? It's because they said finally there's attention to the problems that we have here in the community. And they have also subscribed to the discourse that drugs are a problem. Of course, we can deconstruct this, and it's actually embedded in the question of precarity and poverty. But they said attention has been given, but there are so many mistaken identities, no? At kasama na ako doon. No? So perhaps I'll stop at this point so that others can also feature their chapters, and we can come back later. Thank you.
Thanks, Ma'am Ging. It's interesting that you mentioned violence from the point of view of arrested persons, because for our next speaker, Prof. Mary, it's exactly that kind of violence and fear that she explores, but this time from the opposite side of the fence, quote unquote, from the community itself. So maybe, Prof. Mary, you can tell us more about your chapter.
You're on mute, Ma'am Mary.
All right. Is that all right now? Okay now?
Yes, yes.
All right. Okay. Let me start by saying that my source of all of the information that I have that is shown in the book came from, a series of focus group discussions that I held with 30 urban poor community leaders from 12 different urban poor communities. And these are communities I know pretty well because I've worked with them, with the NGOs basically, that are partnering with them in their own development struggles. So I asked the organizers, can we bring some of them together to see how they think about this? This was 3 years later, 2019. And the way I formulated, I said, can you tell us how you felt, what you thought in 2016 when it began, because it seemed to be happening in your communities mainly. What you think of it now, 2019, and what happened in between. What was the process? Okay, just the beginning, as I think Ging already said, many of them were very relieved because drugs are a terrible situation in their communities. The mothers, for sure, the women, many of these leaders are women leaders, not all, but they in particular were very concerned because the young people, if they were going to work, going to school, might be, stopped en route by drug gangs, especially later in the evening. And so they were a menace to the community, and many of them were part of a whole string of, which was syndicates running it in the end, drug leaders, although there's a whole range. Some were just drug couriers who were not on drugs, some became drug addicts, etc. So there was a whole range of types of drug users. But the main thing was they felt, well, someone at last is paying attention, doing something about it. So they were very relieved. That's by and large. And that surprised us because from the outside, you see, they're the ones being mainly afflicted. Why are they so quiet? And why are they not objecting, right? And so that's what they said. But what changed? Over the next 3 years, they saw it's continuing to happen. And the pattern was very similar. Middle of the night, police come in, or people, with bonnets. I mean, later on, it was motorcycles coming by and just shooting. But in the beginning, it was mainly police invading the house inside, going inside, which people, this is our home. It's a little shack maybe, but it's our home. This is our place. But they just go in, tell all the women and children to leave, or the older people, and the only one left is the male, who's the one they're usually after. And the next thing they hear from outside is gunshots. And then the police come out and say, Nanlaban, he fought, so we had to kill him. And that then started the seeds of doubt about, is this really good in the long run? Because, hey, my husband didn't even have a gun. How could he now have a gun in his hand and they say he shot them or he threatened them, etc.? You would hear stories like that all the time, that many of them were defenseless, right, according to the survivors. So the sense of, this is really wrong, that you can go after drug addicts, but there is a system, there is a law. Take them to jail, but rehabilitate them. Why isn't that happening? Why do they just kill them? They have no compassion at all to realize why some of them are in drugs, to earn because they have no other source of income, or young kids who just get a little money by running the drugs without themselves being drug users, and so on. That the realization that this very vindictive force doesn't understand why this is happening. It's not fair, right? And you hear that often. It's not fair to be judged like that across the board and then simply killed. So that, you might say, disillusionment or dismay at what was happening to them with no recourse, that they couldn't get back. How do you do that with police, especially when your own president is telling them, go ahead, those are bad people. Okay, so that, and then by the end, by 2019, when we were actually talking, they were saying, this is really wrong. It should be, people should have a chance. Okay, they are on drugs, but everybody can reform. That's what they said. They have to be given a chance to reform and rehabilitated in decent surroundings, not taken to jail, beaten up, and then taken to some kind of rehabilitation, which is very questionable. All right, so that's kind of one whole element in the whole book, how it changed from, relief, ambivalence, in the end, it's probably good for us. Those bad guys are either killed, in jail, or many of them ran away. The ones who were likely to be attacked disappeared, went to the province, or were hiding. So the community was peaceful at the beginning, other than those killings. But this is how it changed, as I already said. I guess the other second thing I want to say only is that the organized barangays, and those are the ones I know well, are the ones who began to think it through, working with the community organizers, NGOs, faith-based groups, who are showing them that, hey, there is another way of thinking about this, And as they began to discuss it and look at what's happening, the evidence in their own communities, listening to people in their own communities, they began to organize to figure out how to address it. Just as a quick example, one barangay captain who was the head of the local PO organized group, who was so good at what she did that they elected her the barangay capitan. And so she was somewhat in between, she's accountable to the people, but she's now a barangay official, accountable also to government and the mayor in particular. So she arranged, she delayed for a while giving the names of people in the community. But eventually she was told after 3 months, if you don't submit your list, then you must be a drug coddler and we're going to come after you. So she talked to the police captain of the precinct next, right by there, and said, okay, we will, you give us a list, or if you come with your list, we will take you to those persons' households because we know where they are. But we will be with you. And it's true enough. When they come at 2 in the morning, the Capitana and her team would ring the bell, the whole community would wake up, and a certain group would accompany the police to every household. They would arrest the so-called drug person, and the community would accompany them all the way to the end, outside their area. And so she was very proud, correctly so. There was not a single Nanabang killing in her barangay because the community took it up, but they partnered with the government to say, we know, that's the law, you have to do it, but there are correct ways of doing it, and communities can do that. So that's actually my second message, the last one, that the communities themselves, and as already Ging said, as others have said, and for sure our next speaker will say, the community itself has enormous stake in the whole thing, and especially if they're organized, they can operate very successfully. Unfortunately, this government doesn't look kindly at communities. Any kind of organizing for their own benefit is seen as possibly red tag. So this whole issue of, do you trust your own people? If not, your people will not trust you. And those are my 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am Mary. You're right. The communities are now starting to organize among themselves, and it's a topic that our next panelist actually explores further in her chapter, together with her co-authors, Tanya, Mix, and Abby. I'd like to bring in Ica to tell us more about what it means for communities to actually survive and resist in the age of Tokhang.
Well, now it's Tokhang and COVID, no? But it's another chapter altogether. So, hi, good morning, and thanks for this opportunity. Just to share a bit of a background, no? Our chapter, which is a bit softer, I suppose, it's an offshoot of our empirical work collectively with regard to the multidimensional effects of the drug war on urban poor communities following the experiences of conditional cash transfer beneficiaries and NCR. But building on that experience, no, we wanted to understand beyond counting the bodies, trying to understand the interface between community experiences of trying to survive and civil society responses. And by doing so, begin understanding critically and reflexively the broader ecosystem of community-directed support for survivor families. So for that chapter we wrote, we used the metaphor of the twig and the bound broom, no? That there's a growing acknowledgement of the need to organize. Given that a single twig is broken so easily, but if you band together, there's a higher chance of survival. So some background, when Abby, Mix, and I wrote this chapter, it was the tail end of 2019, and in a way, it was us trying to take stock of our engagement with communities in the drug war. As I said earlier, most of the early work had to do with setting baselines, counting the dead, interrogating narratives, but it was clear to us, particularly from 2018 onwards, that beyond that, what needed to be done was to ensure survival of families, ensuring that the families left behind survive the shock of the drug war and its aftermath. And particularly, given our background in development and public policy, we saw that government, local and national, were tied. Their hands were tied, and people, many of them dared not to ask for help because that kind leaves them legible to state state violence. So in many ways for us, no, what we saw was all the markers of a long tail slow burn disaster, which Prof. Mary and Prof. Ging discussed extensively in their chapters. And so what we saw was multiple vulnerabilities. Each time someone got shot, no, this would be bookended by flooding, fires, demolitions, and the lack of social capital to survive, given that people would shun these families, even their own relatives. And so we try to understand how people try to live through that. And so you did have an ecosystem of people mobilizing from civil society to help these families, no? But you have messages like ayuda is good, but my house is gone. We're not begging for justice. All we want is a fair fight. I mean, you hear those kinds of messages from survivor families, but it makes you wonder, a fair fight. How do you give a fair fight in this kind of context? And so, given that, no, part of what we tried to do was to map those kinds of attitudes and perspectives out vis-a-vis what different civil society organizations try to do from the church. We know the church has been very strong in terms of supporting these families. The nuns, Father Flavi, everything from surviving the initial death to even the current situation with Pangilom, that you have to now disinter the bodies because they're being kicked out from the COVID pension. The guys from street law, no box, the whole ecosystem of human rights and healthcare advocates who are now, have been trying to accompany and prop up, families who have been going through this ordeal. But what we were finding, in a very important sense, was that beyond these external, initiatives, the strongest and the most impressive have been coming from the community themselves. Some of the strongest leaders and voices to protect these families are local leaders, organized groups, and you see that, of course, with COVID, it shifted from the basic need to make sure that they're protected and safe to community pantries to ensure survival. And so one of our favorite quotes is coming from one prominent urban poor organizer who says, sino pa bang tutulong sa mahihirap kung di ka pa mahihirap din? And so it's a kind of stock take for us, which where we want to be able to acknowledge what families and communities are going through without making it about external actors, and being able to support it further in a non-extractive way, because as Gideon said, it's going to be a long fight. It doesn't stop here. And so how do we now, continue this relationship and conversation in the coming years? So yeah, that's the background of our work.
Thank you for that, Ica. Now, before we move on, I'm curious to know, because as anyone who's been in research would know, these chapters certainly did not write themselves, right? I mean, to make a book chapter about the drug war, you'd have to somehow be in the war itself. So I guess my next question is, what were the challenges that you each faced during the conduct of your research and in writing these chapters? Maybe we can start with Prof. Mary.
Oh, well, the concern arises because you see this wave of killings, and wondering over time why, or as I said earlier, why are they not fighting it, or obviously reacting against it. But for sure, the number of killings happening in the ways they were happening was a violation of human rights, the most basic. And I've been long, of course, concerned about human rights issues. I teach a course in anthropology of human rights. So, but from the grassroots level, human rights. So this just, why did I get into this? Why was it worth spending a lot of time to write this and revising it? Because, I felt that story had to be told, and their story had to be told. And I, fortunately, am a kind of an instrument for them to be able to tell it, because of my long connection with them through and the NGOs that work with them. So, the other thing that also disturbed me so much is this sort of the drug war against all those people, as if they're all the same, But I know from our long research, some of them are just couriers, right? Etc. We already said that before, different levels of it. But it's kind of one size fits all, one punishment fits everybody. And of course, as the community very well saw, how come the big people, the drug syndicates, whom they know are connected all the way up there, they don't seem to get away. They don't seem to get, hit. We're still they come from China. We're still dealing, supporting China. So the discrepancies in how come those people who are the wealthy ones, who are really the source of the drugs, don't get punished somehow, and those of us who are trying to make a living this way, um, we get the brunt of it. So when you see that kind of, it's so unfair, then you say, as an academic, what's I have to say something, and the best way we say it is get the evidence, so that what they know and what they see can come up into the you know the policy levels, governance levels, civil society levels, and not just be what people are making cuento in their own neighborhoods from night to night. So that was, I think, why I got very much invested in getting this chapter done.
Thank you, Ma'am Mary. How about you, Ika? How challenging was it, or how different was it from your previous work? How different was approaching this chapter in compared to your previous work? And I also understand that you and your co-authors are members of Sandata, right? The organization. So was this just part of the usual work, or was it something different?
Okay, I have to story time. All right. So my previous work actually, and my current work is on armed conflict in the Philippines, no, and which is partially why Abby and Tanya, we decided to collaborate because personally, a lot of the trauma patterns I see among children of combatants or of former combatants are what we're seeing right now with kids in NCR affected by the drug war. But before I get to that, no, siguro why did we choose to work on this issue? So Abby, Tanya, and I are former government staff and development workers, no, and I think on a fundamental level, what was horrifying was seeing the same communities we were working with, no, on development and empowerment projects, in a span of months being shot down in the street. Basically, it's so counterproductive. The government spends billions of pesos trying to lift these families out of poverty, only to turn around and kill their breadwinners. No, it just doesn't make sense. So, Abby, for example, used to be director for the SWD, and the origins of her of the quantitative aspect of our work had to do with her being in the UK in 2016 and getting dozens of burial assistance requests every single night from on Facebook, no, and not being able to do a thing about it. So, given all of that, we decided to engage, no, starting from, as Ma'am Mary said, from the quantitative, empirical baseline aspect into now trying to understand the evolving needs of people for survival. Uh, in terms of why we decided to work as Sandata, so for those who are not aware, Sandata is a collective of people, development workers and artists, working on drug war concerns, because it was very clear for us that as we did the research, no, the work cannot be extractive. We cannot just write a paper in English, have published in some journal abroad, and have done with it. It doesn't work that way. So one of our priorities at the very beginning was to ensure that whatever material that we were gathering, data we were gathering, processing, their narratives could be returned back to the communities for their own use in a form that they understood and could appreciate. And for many of these communities, no, hip hop happened to be a very important language, no. If you recall, dun sa week ni Nakia, no, meron mga nag-hip hop na mga bagets, and so part of the experiment was, as we were doing rigorous research, ensuring that the materials first and foremost were released in popular form, whether through with our work with PCIJ with artists, or with the collateral album that Balakid and Calix had led. No, so Yeah, challenges faced, definitely it's multi-level because we were doing multiple aspects of it at the same time. And we have actually you did something about this on the methods component. No, first of all, ensuring working with reliable data, and because we were working with four P's, no, ensuring that we had an engagement that was healthy with government, using government data. Second was ensuring an ethical process of engagement with those affected communities, and while doing so in an non-extractive manner. And from there, sustaining that engagement hanggang ngayon, even with COVID, even beyond, no, making sure it's meaningful, mutually meaningful, and that they also own the findings and their own uh, trajectory moving forward. So yeah, it's not easy, but it's the only way that we can do this and live with ourselves, basically.
Thank you, Ika. And how about you, Ma'am Ging? I mean, you interviewed people who were already arrested, who were already incarcerated. So, what were the challenges toward making this chapter possible in the first place?
Yeah. Actually, I have to say that in terms of getting access, in terms of um, the worries about challenges were actually mine, because I said, this is the first year of the war on drugs. So many people are getting killed. I better get on the field. And since I have a network of criminal justice professionals with whom I've been familiar with from past research, I asked them, could I please do a study in your jail? And I was surprised that. So anyway, let me just say that the challenge for me was making sense of the contradictions. No, I was actually expecting them to be no, to be saying no. We are prevented from, but I realized that they actually wanted stories to be told, even from the point of view of law enforcement, or even from the point of view of jail wardens. Um, I just want to have a bit of an anecdote. Ano? That particular warden, of course, I will not mention which jail, actually got into trouble by inviting or allowing foreign journalists to document the congestion of the jail. And he said, I have to do it so that people will see what's going on inside. No, so parang the challenge for me was the difficult part was making sense. How come there are so many contradictions? But as far as interviewing um, the jailed or the arrested persons, they were very much willing to tell their story. That's why I was interested in their counter narrative, because we all know that in this time or at that time, the persons with the least credibility would be them. So it was also challenging for me to hear so much suffering in terms of human rights abuses. No? Many of them were tortured. Ganito yung ginawa sa kanila, ganito yung ganyan. So you can really see how an authorized force of violence just bulldozed its way to yung mga taong, as I've said, walang kalaban-laban. No? And this recalled to me the theory of some sociologists who said that the most successful path to violence, no, successful violence, the best strategy to it is attacking the weak, and this is what happened. So the challenge was to me internal, because I couldn't make sense of the no, yung sobrang violence na dinaanan nung mga tao. And then later on, I would like to say na parang it's like peeling layers and discovering puzzles along the way. How come, for example, police officers are also willing to be interviewed? No, they had no qualms. No, they gave me permission. This is not in the chapter, no, but in continuing to make sense of the larger puzzle, I also went to them, and sila mismo have complained against the war on drugs and said, huli na lang kami ng huli, hindi naman nawawala ang drugs. No? Saan namin ilalagay yung mga taong hinuli namin? I have arrested someone whom I know is not guilty, but they might charge me of, some kind of corruption for arresting him. So I just put him into jail. No, so this mess that we're in have layers to peel. And as a researcher, writing was writing and making sense was the biggest challenge for me. Yes.
Thank you, Ma'am Ging. Speaking of mess, I guess we are down to our last question. I mean, we're all aware that our book is somehow located in a special point of our country's current history. So I guess my last question would be, given the upcoming elections and with drugs, no doubt going to be a central issue in these elections, how do you see things moving forward, especially with respect to your chapter? I mean, what are the implications? What are your recommendations with regards to this subject? Maybe we can start with Ma'am Mary.
Oh, okay. There's so much one could say here, but maybe I could focus on the need to provide employment, especially for the young ones, the 18 to 35-year-olds who often, are left without incomes, or they're looking on the side and they try to make it on the side, but the employment situation for them is really terrible, especially for the males, also for the women. The women earn a lot, kind of, nagtitinda and so on, but the women can find ways, usually small scale, but it's the men who feel they should be the head of the household and should be earning. And when they can't earn, of course, that lowers their own self-esteem. It causes great fights in the household. So the issue of employment, and if that means more training and free available training, educational processes, TESDA has done some very good stuff. In fact, the barangay capitana that I mentioned, when she wanted to do something about the drug people, drug sellers in her community, the ordinary ones, she arranged with TESDA for them to get training, and she mobilized them. She showed them, okay, these are the things you might get training in, and so they went for training because she facilitated that. And so some of them were able, to fix computers and so on, all kind of knew the new technology that they can really handle. So those are the kinds of things. Definitely, the issues of employment are crucial, because if you don't have income from valid, sort of legal ways, and they have no other option but to be attracted to that, because it also pays very well, depending on where you are in the hierarchy. So I think that would be one that I would definitely, challenge the candidates to address, but that has to be local level. It has to be at local level, and it has to recognize the community strengths. And they're the organized associations, of which every community has a number of them. Some of them are POs, the ones I know best, organized by NGOs to try and get an overall community view. Develop schemes for relying on them, encouraging them, finding ways where that can survive. The COVID has shown that they have been very resourceful because they're organized, they have contacts, they try to resolve issues as best they can. So betting, employment and betting on the community to handle a lot of its efforts, but supporting them and dignifying their efforts, respecting them, recognizing also that women are often the major reformists at community level because they know their communities. Those would be at least two out of many. Thank you.
Thank you, Ma'am Mary. How about you, Ma'am Ging? What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, so I listed here. I have here a list of what I will say to a politician hoping to solve the country's problem. Number one, there's no such thing as one size fits all understanding of drug use. No, hindi siya yung idea na um, kapag user wala ng kwenta, etc. My participants contest that. You know, they say I am a worker. Sometimes I use drugs to be able to deliver what is required of me. No, so parang because they needed some kind of superhuman strength. No, so why is it that they required strength to overcome these difficulties just to survive life? You know. And the second is that solve the difficult problems of society and do not just place it on a convenient scapegoat. You know, that is the drug problem, and these more difficult problems that should be faced would be labor precarity, poverty, and the housing crisis. And siguro the thing that I will place and challenge to politicians is that how do you improve your country without going to war against your own people? You know? So the idea of please do not go to war against your own people. Yun po.
Thank you, Ma'am Ging. Finally, Ika, what are your thoughts on this matter?
Things moving forward, no? First is that, as we know, Duterte got the imprimatur to do the drug war because of the notion that killing people will make us more safe and less vulnerable. What we're all finding is that it's not the case. No, we're actually opening up multiple layers of vulnerability for more people who needed state support the most. No, so the challenge, I think, particularly for the next leaders, is to now reimagine what safety and security means. No, how do you now go beyond securitization? And then what this means for neighborhood safety and relationships on the ground level. No, the second is this is something which we'll be living with for decades to come. No, so there might be a need to review the social and economic costs of the drug war, yung longitudinal effects. No, so this is not in this chapter, but when in our previous academic paper we saw so many cases of children. For example, one case, no, saw his father murdered, knew that the neighbor was responsible, is now saving up money to buy a gun. This is a kind of radicalization which I've previously only seen with Abu Sayyaf or Maute orphans. So how do you now reverse this kind of hatred, festering hatred, and foster more caring communities, no, which won't treat these people as a problem, but as people with very real needs and frailties. And we all know, whether middle class or otherwise, people who are battling drug addiction or use drugs recreationally. So I think this project, no, will go a long way in trying to reframe this kind of debate, no, and investing towards more mental health interventions and therapies that are effective. Beyond that, no, going towards the economics of the drug trade, following the money, because that's something which came up very, very clearly at the community level, not only as an incentive for engaging in the drug trade, but also what locks this kind of dynamic in. And lastly, since we're closing, no, this cannot go on. It's just not feasible. Global experiences say that these drug wars are ineffective. And so we have to cut to the heart of the matter. Why is it that this happened in the first place? And as a friend described yesterday, it was basically killing chickens to scare the monkey, signaling power and impunity. So, beyond that, how do we now ensure that we can move forward and heal what has been damaged? So it's a hard task moving forward. But yeah, that's where we are.
Thank you, Ika. Thank you, Ma'am Ging, Ma'am Mary, for your insights. I hope that our little webinar somehow finds its way to some politician out there, or even just a politician staff. I mean, these insights would really go a long way toward informing our future policies. Moving forward with our webinar, we now open the floor for some questions. I believe we already have some questions that came in throughout the course of the morning. The first one is from Manuel Angulo. Manuel asks, Manuel is wondering if there have been any efforts to identify and specifically seek out queer and LGBT plus victims and survivors of the war on drugs? Is this something that the scholarship, yours, or perhaps your colleagues have attempted to unpack? Would anyone want to take up the question?
He says Ica. He mentioned Ica.
So direct answer, Manuel, thank you for your question. It's an important one, but unfortunately in our research, we didn't have a specific window or of analysis for LGBT or queer victims. But definitely through yung mga anecdotal accounts, meron talaga dyan, no? So I think queer scholars, no, who are out there, queer activists, is something which might need to be reviewed moving forward.
Yeah, Game, I know. Let me just say that that subject didn't come up at all. I didn't ask it, and it wasn't raised. So it may not just be, that dominant in their thinking, or because LGBTs are really a kind of a minority in the community, they may not want to have themselves identified as that. But I think it's a subject worth investigating. Manuel, you should be the one to do that research because I know you're interested in that. But Ging might know more.
I'm sorry, no, it's a very important aspect, but likewise, no, I went to a male, a very male-centered. I interviewed the highly male-centered population, no? So persons deprived of liberty, yung mga nasa jail, at yung mga police, no, and there is that sense of maleness, no, in this war on drugs. No, I don't know, no, that may not address the question, but that's the larger context. It's a war of men, and the victims are men. Of course, when we dig deeper, the women, no, are suffering, and I can imagine there might be unuttered sufferings as well of the LGBT, specifically from the sector.
All right, thank you, Ma'am Ging. Our next question is from Vivian Navarro. Vivian asks, what do you think are the long-term effects of the drug war to our youth? This is something that I believe Ica has already hinted at earlier, but perhaps we can also expand on it further. What do you think are the long-term effects of the drug war to our youth, morally, socially, psychologically, or perhaps in some other aspect?
I'll take a first crack at this. No, this is not in our chapter in the book, but it's in our published paper on 4P families. No, ang sakit kasi ang patong-patong yan. Una, for the most part, pag namatayan ng tatay, and usually, as sabi nga ni Ma'am Ging, usually mga tatay na breadwinner yung pinapatay noon nung unang round. Siyempre, first reaction, drop out yan. No? And many of them drop out not only because of lack of money for sustaining education, but also there's a stigma in the community. You're a pariah. You're pointed at as, anak ng pinokhang. Diba? It's something that it's not because of your classmates or neighbors, but also your relatives. They're afraid to condole with you because they're afraid that by associating with you, they will be tainted as well. And that was very clear and palpable during the first 2 years of the drug war. And so we ended up speaking to the survivors, the kids who were of majority age, 18 and above. We didn't talk to the young ones, as well as yung mga lola tsaka yung mga adults who were taking care of them. And grabe yung effect, kasi particularly in NCR, many of the vigilante killings were also affected by neighbors, people they knew. One respondent said that they knew that their father's killer was that guy because he had treated the whole neighborhood to 10 pieces of beer the day after the payout. No, and there are other children who were there during the actual killing and may not have been killed but were shot, collateral damage. No, so that really does create deep fissures. But they also know that it's not their time na mag-rest back. Hindi panahon para mag-revenge. No? So, yeah, yung sabi nga namin na yung isang batang nag-iipon para makabili ng baril. Hindi yan rest back ngayon. Pero ang tanong, at some point, mangyayari yan. And I'm afraid of what will happen when we reach that point.
Ma'am Mary, is this also something that you saw in the communities that you worked with?
Well, one of the things that really disturb me very much is what something was already mentioned, that the fear, right? That when this was so becoming rampant and nobody knew who's going to be the next, especially if you ever had any drug dealings, even as courier, you might be the next. So this fear, and what I call in the chapter, the new normal was fear for a long time. You know, the first, well, almost up till now, although it seems to be less, but you don't know. Anyway, but fear, but then it became normal, so they learn, urban poor, they learn how to deal with all kinds of stresses and strains. So this is another yet one, another thing they have to deal with, but it has become normal. I mean, kids have seen, people wrapped up with placards in the street. They all gather around, they look, and it's become ordinary for these kids to see dead people around, bleeding, waiting for somebody to pick them up. And so certainly that's not a good way for young people, children, to be introduced to the world. And it's, of course, urban poor children. This doesn't happen in middle class and upper class communities. I mean, if young people, if somebody's arrested, they're taken somewhere to jail, maybe. But it's definitely a low income class situation. And that is really, so it's going to create all kinds of difficulties. Just think of the mother now who has lost her partner, so there's a whole income problem. She has a baby. If that baby doesn't get the proper food before up to the age of 5, its brain is going to be mentally deficient or lesser. So that a whole population, and could be even one third of the city of Manila, Metro Manila, as many as that still are afflicted this way. And of course, other cities also, that we don't pay much attention to, but it's happened elsewhere. But certainly, Major Manila, this is, what are you doing to one third of a very striving population? Yes, there are prostitutes and drug addicts and so on, but the majority of the urban poor are people who are there because they want to make a living that's better than the lives they had for their children in future. And that's what we have to understand about them.
Thank you, Ma'am Mary. How about you, Ma'am Ging? I mean, I with your research, I can't even begin to imagine. On the one hand, you already have incarceration in itself, and then you add the aspect of the drug war on top of it. So how how has that affected the youth dimension in terms of your research?
Yeah. Okay. I think Ika and Mary has already mentioned a lot, but I would also like to add that there seems to be some kind of satisfaction of the outcome of the war on drugs, and I am worried about cementing that moral divide between the notion of violence works, and that it's a way of disciplining, and there's this way of dividing between the good poor and the bad poor, the criminal versus the non-criminal. So the increasing polarization uh, of moral divides, no, and the classifying people into that and looking at violence as a solution. That's what I'm worried about for the future generation, that they may look back to this and say, oh, that was the glory days, and
Yeah.
without, I mean, I'm speaking about yung mga hindi direktang nagsuffer, no, sa war on drugs, like the middle class, or maybe the other side of the community na hindi naging victim, no, dun sa patayan. So that's the moral aspect that I'm worried about.
Yeah, can I add just to that, Vincent, that one of the things that, they're saying, well, when I said, what is it now? They said, drugs are back. You can get drugs now almost any street corner, only it's more hidden because they know now what tactics are. That's one. So it hasn't solved the problem, definitely. Um, the second thing is that now the killings have expanded that, or to the motorcycle guys, with the bonnets who come by. Nobody, are they the police? I mean, now there's the belief that, oh, it could be that neighbor who was jilted by his girlfriend who went for another guy, and so this guy kills the other guy. So lawlessness, that has been developed, so that other people begin to take the law into their own hands, and it's not even law, killings, because they know that it's going to be seen as part of the drug, contraining the drug war, when actually they are just bandits and criminals who are taking advantage of the situation to exact revenge on rival gangs, which has nothing to do with drugs, but the drug war has created that additional situation of fear.
Right. Thank you, Ma Mary. Um, Moving on to our next question. Chuck. Chuck asks, what is the contrast in the conduct of the drug war in urban poor communities versus rural communities? Is this something that any of you, or perhaps even Gideon, has somehow managed to explore? Would anyone want to take a stab at the question?
That's a very good question. I'm tempted to call upon Ika who has experience in working in communities in Mindanao to address that. I know Ika will have something to say about this, but I would say that yes, we have seen how even the scholars who are studying the patterns of the drug war would show how it has shifted in terms of geographic location from Manila to at some point Bulacan, Central Luzon, and even places like Cebu as well. So in terms of the drug war, yes, it's very good to really ask that and look at the specificities of drug use in rural areas. I keep on telling people this anecdote that I heard it from Palawan about people who use methamphetamine so that they can dive deeper into the sea, so that they can catch fish, they can catch seafood. So yes, there is. It's not acknowledged. It's poorly documented, but that's something that we in the book we list down as part of the important research agenda. This has to move forward. We have learned so much, but there's so much more that there is in the country in terms of the drugs to understand. That's why we're here not just to share our findings, but also to actually invite people to join us in continuing this work because there's so much to unpack. So, Ika, can we hear from you also?
Sige. There's a reason why I haven't published anything on the drug war in the rural areas because it's just so dangerous, no? Dahil kung dito may particular NCR model, pagdating sa kunyari Mindanao or Visayas, may ibang tenor siya na nag-interface with the local politics, no, and shadow economies of the area. So I'll just maybe pose certain questions. We know, for example, that many of the scalawags, di ba, quote unquote, ng NCR pinapatapon sa Mindanao. Does anyone ask where they are right now? If they're still alive? Or second, for example, do we still remember the many, many mayors who have been killed for being drug coddlers, no? Those things, kumbaga parang nawala na lang sa isip natin kasi patong-patong, no? Pero I can say from working and continuing to work in these areas, those effects are very much felt, no? Kasi if you go to the LGUs where, for example, there's one LGU in Maguindanao na yung buong executive group ng mayor inubos in one go, no? Kasi naglaban. May effects yun on local government efficiency, definitely, among other things. And I've been spending a lot of time in Maguindanao recently. If you go to Cotabato City, for example, you'll see big tarps actually saying that, put badly, no, we know that you've lost a lot of money during the pandemic with COVID, but wag kayo kumapit sa droga. So this speaks of what Ma'am Mary was also referring to, that right now, no, the drug trade is still there in full force, and I suspect that with yung different effects of the lockdowns, no, on the economy, people are actually forced now to trade even more in it. So I encourage people far braver than I to actually write on this, because it's an important issue that has crazy effects on local governance, and particularly with elections next year.
Thank you, Ika. Yeah, I agree. We definitely need more researchers, more scholars, more people involved in the subjects that we have dealt with in the book, especially now that the drug war has, in our own research, has somehow pushed people who use drugs, their families, into the fringes, into becoming what we call hidden populations. Okay, so I guess we still have room for a few more questions. Uh, Jethro De Castro. Jethro De Castro asks, how do we address the popularity of the war on drugs among different social classes? I mean, this is something also that we've talked about, right? Especially as what Ma'am Mary earlier emphasized. Most of the victims of the war on drugs in her research has been in the urban poor. So how do we address the popularity of the war on drugs? Perhaps we can focus beyond the other social classes. Would anyone want to take a stab at the question?
That's Kingsfield, and I don't
Yes,
do
ma'am.
middle and upper class, so I don't think I can answer anything there.
Or it doesn't have to be upper or middle class. Perhaps even in the in the lower income classes. Yes, ma'am. Ging.
Yeah. I've looked at the public opinion surveys, no, and as I've mentioned, it troubles me to recognize that the war on drugs had support. No, but if you look at the statistics, it's slowly going down because people are realizing that it is not targeting actually what it wants to target, and there are very costly trade-offs, no? Like extrajudicial killings, a violation of human rights, so that over the years there's a waning support for the war on drugs, and there is also an increasing fear of having people getting killed through extrajudicial killings, etc. So I think there has got to be a continuous education, no, sa public na this is not a simple issue but rather a complex one, no. It's very difficult, no, and challenging, no, and I would like to say that Gideon's book is one such effort, no? But I know we should think of other ways of reaching out to the public, whether middle class, upper class, lower class, no? Kasi makikita natin, even among the lower class, it has support also. But there's also the realization that something is wrong somewhere. So how do you um, stretch out that discomfort about it's good but it's not good, no, like what my participants said, the paradox that I was looking at in my studies, he articulated so eloquently. Ito pong nangyayari ay mabuting masama, no? So so how to communicate that, no, as social scientists beyond our research is a challenge.
Well, if I can just add on the social class issue, still, the notion of informal settlers or urban poor are not good people. They're illegal, and so after years and years, there's so relatively little compassion among certain groups in the middle and upper classes. And so, as long as you have that distancing, you know, they and they have the power, they're not going to do much. I think there is much more of a need to connect I'll call it middle class, the non-poor, with the poor as people. I know that just once was asked by DPWH to help their engineers understand why is it that the urban poor refused to move to what they thought was much better settlements. They have housing, outside the city. Of course, so I said, why don't you ask them yourselves? And so to groups who are organized, who know how to speak for themselves, who've done many things, we brought these engineers to four different organized communities who really fought relocation, uh, and to stay in their place. But what they wanted was upgrading, improve their situations, or at least find a nearby place where they can move because the employment is there, their kids are in school there, they have a network of friends and neighbors who help them, and so on. So when those engineers talked to them just for one day, I said, you don't say anything. I mean, you don't prescribe anything, just listen. So the first morning, they listen to the communities explain what they do and why they cannot move there, even though the houses might be better, but why government couldn't improve on site or near site. And when they came back the next day to the session, um, their main comment was, what I found out? They really just like us. In other words, they're good people, pala. They just want a better life for their families. So we need really to think that. So what I'm saying is, because they have that personal experience of actually talking on an equal basis with people who were telling their stories, they were very much affected and appreciative. But that's a very small case. But it shows that unless we have better connections between, the non-poor and the poor, on a personalized level, and that can be organized easily through the churches and through civil society, through government. Now there are mechanisms for that. But we have to take it seriously. We have to look for ways, because that you have to change that upper middle class mind about the urban poor. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Ma'am Mary. I completely agree. And this is me speaking not as moderator, but as contributor and researcher as well. No, most of the time it's really just the initial connection or exposure that other people need in order to start changing their mindsets, right? I mean, when my friends, for example, or family members find out that I'm involved somehow in drug-related research, I mean, you wouldn't believe. I guess you would believe the range of expressions that I get from them, right?
I'd also just like to add, Vincent and everyone, that in terms of looking at the popular support for the drug war, our book showcases different perspective. That will be the subject of the next one of the next webinars in the series. We will be looking at how different sectors of society have participated in this idea that drugs are evil. That's really the fundamental thing here. So, for example, we have the paper of Claire David, Cheryl Soriano. They look at how media perpetuates the official discourse of drugs as evil, and as these so-called drug addicts as the ones responsible for the most heinous crimes in our country. If you listen to the radio, if you read tabloid stories, you can see how these are uncritically repeated in these various media. And that's where you can begin to explain and make sense of how and why this drug war has been popular. And historically, we can also look at how actually this demonization of drugs started way back in the 1970s, when Ferdinand Marcos invoked the specter of the drug addict as an existential threat to the nation and used it as one of the grounds for declaring martial law. You can read that in his Sona in 1972, I believe, and even 1971. That's something that we also documented in our scholarship. So we need to look at the history of this. This is definitely something that goes beyond and before Duterte. And that's part of how we can begin to understand how this drug war has become popular and has remained popular despite the reassuring sign that Namging referenced earlier, that there's people are changing their attitudes as well. People are seeing how it has failed. But we need to look at regional examples as lessons. If we look at Thailand, there was a time when after Thaksin's drug war in 2002, the Thai had enough of it and decided to stop it. But just several years later, politicians were saying that, oh, we should have continued the campaign of Thaksin. That was very similar to what Duterte did in 2016. So we need to look at the history, we need to look at regional examples, we need to interrogate how different sectors. If you look at the police textbooks and how people who use drugs are portrayed in these textbooks, you'll understand why they think that what they're doing is justified. So let's look at all of these. And in the book, we do reference some of that.
Thanks, Gideon. And it's great that you mentioned the role of the media, because that's actually our next question. The question comes from Jan Bernadas, my former professor. Hello. In what ways can media organizations and professionals learn from your respective chapters? I guess Gideon has already said his part. Maybe our other panelists can share their thoughts. Ica, how about you?
Probably two things. One is centering community voices in the narratives that journalists are able to construct. No, trying to find how communities choose to frame experiences in their own words. That's the very first thing. And the second is being open to exploration. So some of the the earliest issuances we had of our research outside this chapter, was with PCIJ and with other syndicated, news institutions, who not only gave us a platform for our research, but also allowed us to do more creative forms of engagement. So there would be, for example, an article, but there would also be illustrations, and then eventually what became collateral. No, so yeah, those two things: community voices, and then exploring new forms of engagement and dissemination.
How about you, Ma'am Mary or Ma'am Ging? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Okay, I'll let her think. I'm just what came to mind was something that the Ateneo School of Journalism, Center for Journalism, is doing under Director Luz Rimban, which they're training citizen journalists. And so I've been slightly involved in that and very, admiring of it, because they, as communications people who are in the media themselves, knowledgeable about it, they are looking in organized communities, people who are interested, many times young people who have cell phones already. They help them document what's going on in their communities, what's important. If there is a problem, document it. And then they teach them, how you lay it out, and you have to think of what's in the background, and, and sort of how is the picture, if it's going to be a video, for example, or how you take pictures, and then report it to a website. I mean, connect them with a website or connect them with some entity, maybe a regular newspaper that would like to feature some of this. So that was something what Ica is already talking about, bringing out those perspectives, but that the media people can be right in the community if they learn the basics, including ethics. And they're very strong on, there are certain things you must keep in mind, not to violate the rights of the people that, the community. So, that's just another way of looking at strengthening community skills in themselves, being a media force. Right? Yeah.
Thank you, Ma'am Mary. Ma'am Ging, you have any thoughts on this?
Siguro I would encourage the investigative type of reporting, and maybe take up analytic approaches from social research, where we look at the historical trajectory. No, I have this na hindi ko pa siya full analysis, no, but rather I'm thinking about the trajectory of the war on drugs when it started, because it was popular, and then it stopped at some point, and there was a recalibration on its approach, and then it proceeded again, and then they realigned it so that included ang community, included ang mga pare, etc. So I was thinking, is the government changing its approach? Is it listening to the human rights groups? Is it listening to the civil societies? So my takeaway here is that um, tayong publiko, no, the civil society can make an impact and tell our government, hey, stop, you're already doing too much. And then the government will say, oh, sige, I will tweak the approach. It's now double barrel, blah, blah, reloading it in some way. I'm of course, marami pa rin ng violations, but it shows you that dynamic, that yeah, that we can make an impact, and pwede nating pakialaman by protesting, pointing out what's wrong. My point here for journalists is to ang tip I'm sorry if this is a bit judgmental, but that there's a tendency to do cross-sectional documentation. I think the historical view is very important, and also be open to shatter stereotypes, about sources of of information or data or voices. No, I'm recently doing a study on police officers, and it opened a can of worms, and na sila mismo merong ayaw sa war on drugs. Sila mismo felt excluded by the human rights discourse. So sabi ko, I couldn't make sense of what's going on. So sometimes listening to the people that you don't want to listen to. So broadening historically, time-wise, and triangulating or getting different sources from other dimensions would be very important. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Ma'am Ging.
Can
Our
I
next,
just
yes.
add, just that we have to bring in the social media here, because we tend to think journalism is the newspapers and radio, TV, but really we have to come to grips with how the social media handles this, and whether it's fake news, whether it's trolls, whether it's people who just talk based on their stereotypes and promote that. So that's really the area where we have to begin to understand how to do it. And we need the people in communications, especially, to help us there. Yeah.
Agree, Ma'am Mary. I mean, in our book, for example, there's just one chapter on the media itself by Professor Soriano and her colleagues, Dr. David and Miss Jana Atun. But I agree that in terms of media alone, there's so much more that we can talk about and needs to be talked about. However, our viewers are also interested in another aspect of the drug war, which we have actually touched upon already. We have several questions that center on the role of the police and policing institutions in the war on drugs. Kenneth Cardenas, for example, asks, there used to be a people-powered or people-centered thinking behind the setting up of the PNP and post-1991 barangays as a conscious departure from the Philippine constabulary and a concentrated top-down executive power. But the war on drugs seems to mark a return to both these patterns. So do you think there is room for policing and local government as institutions to be pulled in the other direction again?
That's King or
Yes,
Gideon.
ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, Ma'am Ging. I'm looking at you.
Yeah, my study is still very tentative, but I would definitely say yes. Um, the police can be, as law enforcement agency, as an institution, it has its own culture, cultural institution, even way before the war on drugs. No, we have to look at the police not just as a monolithic institution who just listen to the president. They have their own culture, they have their own experiences, they have their own grounded reflections, no, and so on. Um, you can also trace the changes, no, in how our state has handled the police. No? Before the Duterte administration, there had been efforts to professionalize. So remember, they were called SPO2, SPO1, and their uniforms were civilianized, and it was important for them to get not military degrees, but degrees in other professions, and be civilianized. But then during the Duterte period, you can see they have changed their uniform to that type C, I think, you know, a counterinsurgency version, and they acted military-like. No? So yes, no, as an institution, they can be pulled to different directions, no, and napakahalaga nun. And fortunately, my interactions with the police have shown their openness, no, to better governance, no, and to more. They didn't use the term human rights because they have problems with how it's operationalized. No, so ang sinasabi nila, ang mga kriminal may human rights pero kami wala. No? And you would also see dimensions in the police life. No? And I confronted one officer, for example. I said, "Why do you just raid the slums and not the middle class neighborhoods, no? And not the ecstasy and other kinds of drugs?" And then he told me, "Ma'am, I cannot go into the clubs that the middle class because I don't look like them. But you see, in the slums, I will just blend easily." So that the class factor surprised me. No, so there was also one instance. No, I'll be very fast. I know. There was a police station, a big one, that when I asked permission to conduct my research, they called everyone, no, the officers, and then we were presented that, "Ma'am, these are the efforts that we're doing. We have programs to rehabilitate the the persons that we have arrested through our community service committee, so on and so forth. And we have even echoed this to the headquarters so they can replicate the good that we're doing here." And I was telling him, "Sir, isn't that the job of of the SWD? Why are you doing rehab work when you are in law enforcement?" No, and they said, "Because we have to solve what's in the ground. You know, if we keep on arresting people, nothing will happen." In other words, even from below, social actors, no, police officers, as individuals who are self-reflective, try to reorganize, no, and respond to the realities. So I see much hope in pulling them to better directions. Uh, Thank you.
All right. So thank you, Ma'am Ging. We do have other questions related to the police from Tina Huyugan and Michael J. But in the interest of time, I would like to invite you to our future webinars, since our other speakers, our other book contributors will actually talk more about the role of the police, the role of local government, barangay captains in the conduct of the war on drugs. So before we wrap things up, I know we've had a long and fruitful, productive discussion. Would our speakers have anything else to add to the discussion? Anything they'd like to leave our viewers? Maybe we can start with Ika.
Sige. More of a pahabol na response sa huling tanong, no? Yung kay Kenneth. Kasi kailangan ibiyakin yung tanong tungkol sa police tsaka yung tanong dun sa local government, no? Kasi, kumbaga, the police, in what my observation, has morphed into something else completely. And based on discussions with friends working on security sector and police reform, medyo it'll take it's going to take a long while to undo some of the harms done, particularly in trajectory towards more securitization and even counterinsurgency. And secondly, but given that, no, there is hope for local governments, there's hope for communities, and that means being able to uh, going back, no, reframing everything, governance, accountability, in terms of yung ating pagtingin sa komunidad, no. The moment that we are able to shift like mayor's perspective from Malacanang to back to their constituents, and that is the beginning of healing, because diba, they're no longer incentivized or afraid to shoot down people, because that's what the old man down the river had said. So I think that's something we need to reconfigure and reimagine, and this will require all hands on deck to see in our lifetimes. So that's it from me.
Thank you, Ika. How about you, Mary?
I guess one final message is talk to the people who have the problem, right? These are urban poor. They themselves, as we saw, are very upset about the number of drug happenings because of the violence that they have generated in the community. They were very happy, as we said at the beginning, and then that changed because of how the government handled it with very little compassion, no really real rehabilitation. So they have ideas. If you ask them, as we know from our barangay capitana, who really figured out some of the things, but that's just one out of how many, you know. But the whole point is ask the people who have the problem, because they're not all going to say, no, you can't take any of these people out. There are people, no, they'll say, take them out. They're terrible, you know, they will pinpoint, but do it in a legal way where they have a chance to be rehabilitated. If they can't be, jail them. So you can get a lot of support from communities if you listen to their solutions. They're very quite realistic, but they're willing, you know, when there's somebody talks to them and asks them and says, well, these are resources that are available. What, you know, they can come to agreement. So trust your own people. Listen to the people who have the problem and discuss with them what solutions they have, and then try to develop it in the larger context so it becomes, a more generalized way of addressing this issue. That's it.
Thank you, Mary. And finally, Ging.
I just like to add, by the way, I forgot one item in my list for politicians, and that is please police our borders. The enemy comes from outside. Don't fight with don't wage a war with your own people. No? It's not my area of specialization, but there are scholars that trace the increase of the influx of precursor chemicals to the Philippines that spurred the domestic production of methamphetamine. So pay attention sa borders natin. And then again, I'd like to encourage researchers to keep on listening to the voices of people, and even this would even include people you don't want to hear from. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Ging. And finally, our book editor, Gideon, perhaps you'd have some final message to leave with our viewers.
Well, I'd like to reiterate what Ika said, that we need all hands on deck in this effort. Our book tries to cover a lot of ground in terms of also responding to policy issues, responding to public health questions, responding to the history of drugs, but there's so much more. And we even talk about, Vincent, in your chapter, you do talk about the role of art and humanities in responding to and challenging the dominant drug discourses. So there's all of us can contribute, and we need to really raise this as an issue as we contemplate new leadership in our country, because we really need to elevate the drug discourse in a way that we can talk about drugs and the people who use them in ways that are humane, compassionate, evidence based, and respectful of people not as addicts or subhumans or zombies, but as human beings. And the work continues. So if you want, for those who are students or listening with us now, joining us, we'd like to invite you to really also pursue this research, and I'm very willing. I'm sure many of our contributors are also willing to give you advice and inputs about how to go about it. And finally, I would like to reiterate gratitude to Ateneo Press for really hosting this book project and for supporting all our contributors. A big thanks to all of you, to our authors, and of course to our audience for engaging us in this very important discussion, the first of many, hopefully, in the months and years to come. So thank you very much.
Yes, Gideon. The first of many. In fact, we already have the second webinar set for December 10th. That's Friday, December 10th at 2:30 in the afternoon. It will coincide with the fourth day of this year's UGAT conference. That's the Ugnayang Pag-angkam Tao, or our Anthropological Association of the Philippines. So I know we have a few more questions that we haven't answered, but believe me, in our future webinars, these questions from Eileen, for example, who's curious as to whether our research can be used by the ICC in their investigation, or Michael and Tina's questions on policing, or BB's further questions on the youth. These questions will all be tackled in our future webinars. This is just the first of many. So before we end, though, for our viewers, I would like to announce that we actually have a book discount promotion. The book will be offered at 20% off starting today, November 24th, until the 26th, which is this Friday. So starting today until this Friday, the book is being offered at a 20% discount. It's now available at the Ateneo University Press store in Shopee. Or you can also email Ateneo Press at books.unipress@ateneo.edu for any further inquiries. So once again, we have the link for the book. It's right on your screens. Promo period is from today until Friday. So that's all the time we have. Once again, I would like to thank Ateneo Press for hosting us today, for publishing our book, to Ugat for co-hosting our series of launches, especially the next one, and to Ateneo Development Studies Program for hosting the project for the last 2 years. And finally, to our dearest contributors, thank you. And to our dearest viewers, see you in our next few webinars. That's all the time we have. Once again, I'm Vincent. Thank you for joining us today.